I hope I can convince you that by the end of this, that we can all have the best things. So yeah, I know what you're thinking. Really, can we have the best things? You know, it's a preposterous idea, right? It sounds utterly ridiculous. For instance, how would that work with a Ferrari? Could everybody have a Ferrari? Or tasty, yummy food like the omakase style sushi that you get for $80 or $100 per person? Or fancy gizmos like the UAVs that all the kids are playing with these days? So, I mean, it all sounds preposterous when we just frame it in our existing way of characterizing things. So let's take a step back first. And, you know, ask, why do we have anything at all? Or how do we have anything at all? And you know, how do we have anything at all is, you know, just we find ourselves in a situation where we have slips of paper or pieces of plastic or whatever, and you give $10 to somebody for some service that you care about, and they provide you that service. Now that person might give the same $10 bill to somebody else, and they get a service that they want, and that person might finally give you back this same $10 bill, and then you do something for this person. So the same $10 bill has gone all the way around and has come back to you. So it would seem that nothing has changed. Why did you even bother with that whole exercise, right? And of course, it's because we need some convention by which we can enforce some kind of order on the space of activity, of human activity, so that it just doesn't devolve into chaos and people just want all the things all the time, and maybe it's not possible. So money is kind of how we've worked out to do this. And it all comes down to desire. Money is sort of the thing that governs desires or wants that we have. Things that we want lead to us interacting. And at scale, it gives rise to economic incentives. So incentives are desire at scale and the interaction of desires. And that's essentially what economics is about. It's about desire at scale. And when we think about it this way, we can see that it isn't just about human systems, but about living systems, because desire is something that characterizes all life. And this is the perspective that I took in my work from almost a decade ago at this point, called identity architecture. And it's a new model that allows us to think about economic systems from this more general perspective of living systems as being economic in some way, or being characterizable in that way. So what is identity architecture? That's a whole other talk on its own, so we won't really get into too many details on that point, but there are a few things that are essential to know, because that is going to be the foundation on which this talk is built. So we'll just talk about that. And the main thing there is this idea of a span of being in economic contexts. When we think about economic activity in a particular context, there's this sort of span that we think about, and it's very simple. It's just anyone, someone, and everyone, right? Whenever you see anybody interacting, you could think about it abstractly as, you know, in terms of these abstract sort of limiting points on this space of activity. And there's also no one, which is sort of transcends the economic context, and it's like, okay, it's not any of these people. So we'll keep these in mind. This is going to be important, okay? And it's very simple, very intuitive. There's nothing complex about this. And so attribution-based economics, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the economic system that is based on some of these ideas. And we are currently prototyping it for open source software. I already mentioned all this, so I think I forgot these slides were here, but this is my EmaxCon talk if you want to learn more about that, because we're not going to talk too much about the software implementation and so on, because that's not what this talk is about. But yeah, actually, one thing that this does bring up is money, right? Open source famously doesn't make any money because it doesn't work in existing economic systems. So we need to talk about money. Like, how does money work? And the first answer I'll give you is, this talk is about solving the problem in the long term. In the short term, we do need to find more pedestrian, more traditional solutions. But we'll keep going on understanding how things should work so that we have a picture of where we're trying to go. So what is money? Well, in old school economic textbooks, there was this famous aphorism: money is a matter of functions for a medium, a measure, a standard, and a store. But over time, economists have sort of drifted away from some of these purposes of money, and they focus more on the fact that money is a medium of exchange and that it is a store of value and a standard by which you can do lending and so on. But they have drifted away from the idea that money is a measure of value. Now, the reason they've done this is mostly empirical or purely empirical, which is that it appears that money doesn't really do a very good job of measuring value. So yeah, it's just not that. And you can have, there are a few counterexamples that can prove this to you, like the fact that the prices of goods and services change. If it's truly measuring the value, like an intrinsic value in some sense, then the price wouldn't be the same tomorrow versus today. And if it were really measuring some kind of intrinsic value, then two different people would pay the same amount of money for it, but that's not true. Some people might be willing to pay more money for the same thing. So economists have sort of drifted away from this. But I would say that money must measure value. And it is because it doesn't measure value that gives rise, this deviation between market value and true value, as we might call it, gives rise to the problems of the world at scale. And I believe that this is the only problem we need to solve. Everything else will take care of itself. But, historically, the reason we've gone this way is because value is a tricky thing, a slippery concept, right? I mean, you might say, well, you can't really measure value. But instead, I would say, let's ask the opposite question. What kind of value is measurable? And the answer to that question is dialectical value, which is value that we agree on. So this is the limit in relation to which we can agree on the measure of value in terms of, or just the ability to measure value. And importantly, this isn't all forms of value, but nevertheless, it is much more forms of value than we might imagine it to be. It is many dimensional, where today the main value that we use in our economic systems today is supply and demand. And it's because supply and demand doesn't really capture our notions of value that it fails to do so, especially in cases where supply isn't defined, like in software, digital art, music. But dialectical value is many dimensional. It is able to take into account anything that we can agree on is valuable, whether it's something in terms of supply and demand or something just in terms of subjective preferences that everyone can agree on without even needing to characterize it in a formal model. So dialectical value is many dimensional, and that is the basis of attribution-based economics. It probes this deeper notion of value called dialectical value. And the manner in which it does it is a device called dialectical mirror, which is closely related to the golden rule taught by Jesus and Muhammad and all those wise people of the past, and also John Rawls more recently, Immanuel Kant in his categorical imperative and so on. I mean, this is the same idea that's been taught over thousands of years. Confucius, it's just everywhere. It's everywhere. But in identity architecture, which is the foundational model for this economic system, it takes on a somewhat precise form. And it is that in terms of the span of being that we saw earlier with it, which is anyone, everyone, someone, and no one, dialectical mirror allows us to look at ourselves in this mirror in such a way that the projection of our activity into this reflection loses all of those details of basically anonymizes a lot of details that are irrelevant to the problem at hand. And this is, the veil of ignorance, for instance, John Rawls as well. So attribution-based economics, for this reason, promises that if you contribute value, you will get paid. Because when you look in the mirror, you're only going to see valuable contributions, and you're going to say, does this person need to get money or not? And then the answer will be yes or no. And then it's revealed that maybe that person was you, or maybe that person was someone else. Maybe it was somebody you didn't like. But the promise is, if you contribute value, you will get paid, and there's nothing further you need to do. You don't need to find a supply and demand-based equation in terms of a startup, or get certain funding from certain special people by doing special favors and so on. You don't need to do any of that. If you contribute value, you will get paid. But this is the big question, right? Where does the money come from? And today, we have to understand, first of all, where money does come from today. Today, not a lot of people know this, but banks create money all the time. This very moment, banks are creating money right now, all over the country, all over the world. They're creating money out of nothing. And depending on how you look at it, the money is either created when someone just puts some money in a bank, and then the bank says, oh, I'm going to like basically consider this as extra money than what's really there. Or banks could just say, oh, you want a loan? Okay, I'm going to make a bunch of money and give you the loan, and now you owe us money. So it's an unintuitive and unexpected thing based on how we think about money. But this is actually how it works today. And some traditional ways of looking at it have been fractional reserve banking, money multiplier. You'll hear all of these terms. But the basic idea is that banks create money out of nothing, and they do so based on ad hoc and empirical heuristics that they've observed to work in practice. That is, they boom and bust cycles have happened, many things went wrong. This appears to solve this particular problem. And then over time, we've come up with pretty robust, pretty good heuristics that approximate some of the more correct ways, I would say, that we are looking for. So we learn from these. These are not necessarily things we just throw out the window. Nevertheless, they are ad hoc, and they're not based in a real conceptual understanding. In Abe, on the other hand, there's a simple principle that money must track value. Because if money is to measure value, then it must be a side effect of value creation. Otherwise, how are we creating money? We're just making it in a vacuum, and then that leads to inflation. So money is a side effect of value creation in attribution-based economics. So does this mean that creating value simply creates money? Yes. Yes, it does. But also, it depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on the kind of value. So let's look at now in terms of the span of being that we saw earlier. There's many kinds of value that we can think about in those terms. Value to no one, value to someone, value to anyone, value to everyone. Value to no one, it could either be an externality that somebody else recognizes as value, but you don't, or it could also be unrecognizable value. And this gets at sort of the limit of the measurability of value, right? Dialectical value is the limit of what we can measure as valuable, but there are things that are not, there are things that are valuable that we can't recognize, okay? That's something we have to accept. Sort of foundationally, philosophically, we have to accept that, but nevertheless, dialectical value can go much further than we think. But yeah, there's also value to someone, which is a private service. If you have like, a Lamborghini or a Ferrari and you want somebody to fix some aspect of its engine or something, that is a private service you're getting. That's value to someone. And then there's value to anyone and everyone, which are kind of subtle concepts that are easy to conflate, but let's look at them. Value to anyone is like medical care. And the way we can think about value to anyone in general is there a property that everyone in a particular context shares? If you provide any value or services based on that property, that is a value to anyone. And so in the world of human interactions, all of us have the ability, we might all fall prey to sickness or disease or something like that. So we all are going to be recipients of medical care at some point. So this would be value to anyone because we all share the property that we can avail of this service. Fire and flood can affect anyone, so that is also value to anyone if you help someone recover from that. But even more unexpected things based on the principle we just talked about are things like haircuts. If everyone in a particular context has hair, then if you're giving a haircut to anyone, that is a value to anyone. And likewise, food, everyone eats. So if you provide food and feed anyone who comes to you, then that is value to anyone. Value to everyone is something that simultaneously affects everyone in the context. For instance, averting a meteor strike, everyone gains by that, presumably. Restoring coral reefs, because if you restore coral reefs, you restore habitats, you restore the fish populations, which leads to more food supply for the other fish and for humans. And the health of the oceans is the health of the atmosphere, which is the health of the planet. So restoring coral reefs is a value to everyone. Reducing pollution is value to everyone. And building roads and other infrastructure, traditional things which are even recognizable today to some extent, are valuable to everyone. Less obvious is vaccines. Because if you take a vaccine, it's not just value to you. The fact that you're preventing the spread of the global spread of the virus is value to everyone. So that also falls in this category. And here is the important bit. Only value to anyone and value to everyone create money. And this is kind of like a mind-blowing thing, actually, because it encapsulates a lot more than we might think. In particular, anonymous services are free because they create their own money. Universal services are free too. If you go dive into the ocean and do something to help the coral reefs, and it's documented, and there's like a system that can establish that you did that, that creates its own money. You just get paid by doing what is valuable. And usually, of course, you would go through some processes where people have agreed that it's valuable before you do something, but that is not necessarily always the case. It can happen retrospectively too. So a few months ago, I did a talk at EmacsConf, and I mentioned some of the problems of the world. And at the time, I just said attribution-based economics can solve all of these problems. But I didn't explain how. So in this talk, I want to talk a little bit more about the how. So hunger, right? Apparently, up to 30 to 40% of the world's food supply is wasted. And according to this article I found, 690 million people go hungry every year. That's about 1 in 10 people in the world is hungry. And the reason, apparently, according to some of this research that I found, is that profits are invariant to more people being fed. That is, if there's less food supply, then prices are higher. So the few people still pay the higher prices and they buy that food supply at the higher price so that the total profit is the same as if the supply were lower and the prices were lower. And as a result, there's not an incentive to feed more people because hunger is an externality. Now, this word externality, I wish I'd bolded it in this slide because it's a very important word. If you ever see this word externality, I mean, this is basically the cause of a lot of problems, okay? Externality is any value that is not recognizable economically in the economic system that is at play. And in capitalism, externalities dominate. As we see in this example, hunger is an externality. And then what is the solution? In Abe, it's easy because everyone can agree, I believe, that hunger is something that is good to avoid, especially when you look in the dialectical mirror, right? You don't know who is in that mirror. And then waste, again, we look in the mirror and we say, do we think waste is bad? Yes. And that's it. That gives rise to an economic incentive. So in a way, actually, just to take a step back on that point, the thing about the dialectical mirror is that instead of allowing, remember we said how economic systems are the interaction of desires at scale, right? But the power of recognizing the sort of the dialectical nature and how we can reflect and see ourselves in the mirror and so on, is that we can put an indirection between the interactions of desire and the origin of economic incentives. Like we have the power to insert something there. And that's what we do when we look in the dialectical mirror. We say that the origin of economic incentives arise by our agreement, rather than simply just like a state of nature, everybody go and kill each other and somebody wins. And by the way, this particular take on it goes back to the Haudenosaunee people of the New Jersey area, who developed what in many respects is the modern form of democracy we all use today. But primarily the orientation of the time was to resolve some of these adversarial forces through dialogue. and instituting sort of the dialectical mirror kind of principle. So yeah, that is hunger. That is how hunger will be solved here, through addressing externalities, which are no longer externalities, because dialectical value is many dimensional and not one dimensional. Now, disease, treatment or cure. So it turns out that in today's economic system, cures are, quote, cost effective but not affordable. And what that means is that pharmaceutical companies are not exactly incentivized to charge you a low amount for a cure, because they stand to earn so much money by you being a chronic customer. Like if you have a chronic medical condition, you're a lifetime subscriber, basically, right? And so cures are not really incentivized, first of all. And secondly, so there's not funding for it, is what I'm trying to say. And secondly, I mean, yeah, but so they have done this, right? They developed a cure for hepatitis C apparently a few years ago. And the cost of that cure is about $500,000, because that, and in fact, that's cheaper than you being a lifetime customer of the hepatitis C chronic management program. But nobody can afford that, right? Even though the marginal cost of the cure is probably very low. That is, it's low to produce a cure. A low cost to produce each instance of a cure, yet it costs $500,000 in order for the pharmaceutical companies to be still profitable and viable, which is fine in an economic system. It's not a value judgment, right? This is a statement against our economic practices. And of course, the reason why this is because of externalities, you know, that's the magic word. And, you know, who pays for this cure, right? In order to keep these companies solvent. And the solution in attribution-based economics is that cures literally pay for themselves because they are value to anyone. So they generate their own money. They create their own money. Next, we have vaccines. Some of the problems we face today in the world are scarcity and misinformation. These are two separate problems. And the reason is because our existing economic systems are property-based, ownership-based. They overuse the institution of property. In particular, they extend the institution of property to ideas and things that are intangible, that have zero marginal cost to produce. And we're just saying, oh, we own this thing now, and we're going to put an artificial supply constraint on it just because our economic systems wouldn't work otherwise. And the problem with this is it limits the scale of operations. As long as you're the only person controlling this value, you're not, you know, it's a boundary condition that you could produce as much scale on your own as you could with everyone in the world helping. And it also limits trust, because as long as you have a secret formula that you've sort of revealed in a patent, but not really, and your production processes are all somewhat secret, and you control the factories that do it and so on, it can lead to distrust. It's just true. It's just a fact. And it does. We see it happen. The solution here in Abe is, first of all, it pays for itself because, as we said, vaccines is value to all, which we signify by omega. And also, attribution-based economics greatly reduces the scope of ownership law and the applicability of property, which it doesn't eliminate. Property is still a valuable and necessary thing, but the scope of it is dramatically reduced because it's costly and it's inefficient. War. There's this famous person who said, I spent 33 years in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Now, this book that he wrote is called War is a Racket, and it was written in 1935, which, you know, if you read it, it sounds like it's written today. And this was before the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. You know, so things don't change as much as we think they do, because our economic systems are the same as they have been. And of course, the reason why wars happen, again, externalities, right? Say it with me, externalities. It's because there's so much cost to war that is just not accounted for in the economic system, and therefore it is not disincentivized. Overuse of property, of course, you know, if you think you need to own something in order to generate value from it. And adversarial competition, as long as it's an us versus them situation, then it better be us, right? So yeah, the solution here are the problems left as an exercise for the reader based on this new framework that we have. Feel free to think about it. There's a lot of specifics that need to be developed. So there's value here to be created. And mental illness, I'll just say one thing on this point, which is that I think depression is rampant today, not because there's something wrong with people, but because there's something wrong with what we're all doing. I mean, just think about your family members, right? Your brother, your sister, or your close friends growing up. Do you spend a lot of time together now? Is it easy to meet people now? No. Because why? Because our economic processes are guided by these guardrails of ownership. And as long as you need ownership to facilitate economics, you're going to separate people. I can't look at the code that my brother might be writing in his company. Not that he's writing code nowadays, which he should. But anyway, never mind. But he can't look at code that I'm working on if I work at some company either, right? There's all these intellectual property things that prevent family and human connections from organically creating value, when in fact that would be better for everybody. So this is why we're depressed. Okay, this is one of the main reasons why we're depressed. Global warming, of course, externalities and value to all, habitat destruction, the list goes on. And I'm sure we can think about how these can be solved with this new framework of the origin of money. Bunch of people helped on this presentation, specifically some of the ideas that went behind it, some of the topics to cover, and so on. And there's obviously so many other people who have helped on various ABE projects and various aspects of ABE operations. It's called ABE, by the way, Attribution Based Economics. And yeah, here's a bibliography of some worthwhile sources. So yeah, I'll leave you with this thought. What can you do for ABE? And it's not a startup, so there's nothing that you need to join. There's no employment contract that separates you from participating and contributing value in attribution-based economics. So there are no boundaries. So join us.